All right, and we're live now. So, Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I'll be the host of today's talk. I'm the executive director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University, and I'm honored to have with me today Professor Brannon Wheeler of United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. Welcome, Brannon.
Thank you, Ermin, for inviting me. And really, I think that's great that you do this program because there's really a need for people who are doing scholarship on these issues to be heard.
Thanks, Brannon. And I should mention that Brannon and I were colleagues at Naval Academy for 7 years, and Brannon was always very supportive and very kind, and I learned a lot from him. And I was happy when I saw this book came out. It obviously was top on my list, not only because of our friendship, but because it truly is one of the best books I've read in the last several years, definitely. And I'm sure anyone who's joined us today and who will watch this later on YouTube will agree to that.
It means a lot for me to hear that from you, Ermin. Thank you.
Of course, you're most welcome. So first I'm going to introduce our speaker and our book. This is the first in our fall online book talk series here at the center. We have 3 more coming up. You can check that on our website. Professor Wheeler is professor of history in the Department of History at the United States Naval Academy. He has a PhD in Near Eastern languages and cultures from the University of Chicago. He's the author of more than 10 books, and the latest of which is the one that we're discussing today, which is Animal Sacrifice and the Origins of Islam, published by Cambridge University Press last year. That is 2022. We already have we have somebody joining us from Helsinki, from Finland. So I'm sure this is reaching worldwide audience. So like I said, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. So the format of the talk is that Brannon and I are going to engage in a conversation for the next about 30 to 40 minutes, plus minus, depending on how it goes. And then after that, we're going to take your comments and your questions. For our audience that is joining us online, you have a chat function on YouTube where you can submit your questions and comments. I would appreciate if you would identify yourself, tell us where you are, where you're writing from. I think it helps us to understand our global reach, but it also is good to know who is on the other side of the question and comment. So I'm going to begin by reading just briefly the description of the book, which is, in my understanding, it's a big attention getter in many ways.
The publishers demand that, right?
Yeah, they do. But this one really stands out. It goes like this. Islam is the only biblical religion that still practices animal sacrifice. Indeed, every year more than 1 million animals are shipped to Mecca from all over the world to be slaughtered during the Muslim Hajj. This multidisciplinary volume is the first to examine the physical foundation of this practice and the significance of the ritual. Brannon Wheeler uses both textual analysis and various types of material evidence to gain insight into the role of animal sacrifice in Islam. He provides a thick description of the elaborate camel sacrifice performed by Muhammad, peace be upon him, which serves as the model for future Hajj sacrifices. Wheeler integrates biblical and classical Arabic sources with evidence from zoo archaeology and the rock art of ancient Arabia to gain insight into an event that reportedly occurred 1400 years ago. So I'll start with asking the question that I always ask first of every guest that's been on this program, and that is, why did you write the book and what is its main argument?
That's a good question. And it's the one question that I knew you were going to ask that I was going to have the most trouble with because I have to think back to 15 years ago. This book took me longer than any other book I wrote to work on, primarily because of all the travel I had to do. And I had to learn new disciplines like zooarchaeology and even what that word meant. But I say in the preface, and I think it's probably the truest answer to this, that I'd been writing for some time about the British scholar Robertson Smith and his famous book, Lecture on the Religion of the Semites, which became the basis for Durkheim and Freud's work and kind of the origins of the modern study of religion. And Robertson Smith features as his primary example this camel sacrifice, which takes place in maybe the 5th or 6th century in the Sinai. So when I was working on my previous book, Mecca and Eden, I had come across the Prophet Muhammad's camel sacrifice, and I kind of thought about it for a bit. And after I finished the book, I realized, wow, that's kind of interesting that I'd never heard about that before. And, I don't know a lot of things, but I thought, I should have ran into that before. This seems kind of a coincidence or something. So I think in a mechanical way, I was trying to put those two things together. The fact that the origins of the modern study of religion depends upon a sacrifice that supposedly took place maybe within 100 years of when the Prophet Muhammad's sacrifice was supposed to have taken place. And then we read the classical Muslim sources, and they tell us that the origins of Islam are with this camel sacrifice that Muhammad performs. So I probably asked three big questions. And so I guess that's the truest answer why I wrote it, to answer these questions. So you brought up one already. So what is the meaning of the Prophet Muhammad's camel sacrifice? And I was hesitant to use the term thick description because everybody knows where it's from, and we're not really sure what it means. And I can talk about it, what I think it means later if you want. The second question was, how was the distribution of the camels and the pieces of them related to the distribution of the Prophet Muhammad's own body parts? Because that had been an interest of mine in my previous book looking at relics and how that functioned. And then finally, and I think that's what brought the two together for me, why is this elaborate practice linked to an eschatological closure of an old world and the kind of beginning of a new creation in Islamic civilization? So I think I want to do what I think I'm supposed to do as a scholar of religion who's interested in Islam, which is to examine the category of sacrifice in the study of religion, this generic thing, by using a specific example of what we think a sacrifice is, and vice versa, trying to understand how our notions of sacrifice in a generic comparative sense affect the way we understand the Islamic material.
Yeah, that's a really great answer to the question. I do remember when we were colleagues, and I remember you talking about this. I think at that time you were already doing this research, and I do know that it took more than 10 years, because I remember when I was there at that time, I think you were working on and published the paper on distribution of the body, the nails and the hair at the farewell pilgrimage. And it was interesting because, even for many Muslims that go, for instance, to places like Topkapi in Istanbul, and they will see the relics from the Prophet, peace be upon him, and they will even see like a few hairs that people claim are from his beard, which could or could not be true. We don't, we don't know for sure. But I think very few people ask, well, if it is, how did it come here? Why did people keep that? And I think your book goes some ways in answering that question. Why Muslims from the time of the Prophet himself, from that time, paid great attention to these relics, and we have, as your book shows, many reports in Muslim books, in Muslim sources, that most Muslims would accept as authentic sources of Islamic religion, like Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim and all of the great canonical books of the Hadith, have reports on this. So it's not like it's some obscure knowledge that has to be found in some unknown book and unearthed manuscript that just came to our knowledge. This is actually in our eyes, but very few people kind of take a lead from that and ask questions. I think you did, and for that, I think that's what I found really fascinating about your book, among other things. But Brannon, please set the stage for the book. So you start the book by describing Prophet Muhammad's farewell pilgrimage and animal sacrifice. So tell us briefly the story. What happened during that? Most Muslims are familiar with the general story of the farewell pilgrimage.
Yeah.
They would know quotations from the Prophet's sermon, famous sermon and so on, but they would not necessarily know the details, historical details, or at least the transmitted details of what happened during that Hajj and what the Prophet actually did and how did he do the Hajj.
Yeah.
So tell us that story and set the stage for the book.
Well, since it's a long story, I will focus on the things that surprised me when I read it.
Okay.
So the first thing that surprised me was this was the only time the Prophet did the Hajj. And I had come to this project thinking, well, he probably did it a lot of times, right? But this was it. He did it one time. He did it at the end of his life. And the whole time people were watching, of course, because they're like, oh, we're going to have to do this after he's gone. And we want to make sure we understand how to do it, which immediately puts a lot of importance on what he did and the hadith reports of what he did, so that later jurists can say, oh yeah, this is how you do this part. So he did Umrah a lot of times, but he didn't go out to Arafat and Muzdalifah and Mina except for this one time. So that was of interest to me. You mentioned before we went before we went live that I've been interested more recently in Hajar al-Aswad, and part of my research there grows out of this, because when he goes to the Kaaba to circumambulate it, he has to greet the black stone. And so there's a lot, the same project could be done looking at that. So the other thing that is of interest, I think, that people know is that he went out after he was in Mecca doing the circumambulation, and he went down to Arafat. As you know, that's part of the Hajj. And the whole time he seems to have had a number of animals with him, and it's unclear how many he had. Part of what's interesting in the reports is that, well, he had 100 or he had 30, and then Ali brought 30. Some of the sources tell us that Muhammad had sent Ali on a mission to destroy a pagan temple in Yemen, and that Ali went there, and as part of the booty that he took from the people were the camels that he brought back that eventually got sacrificed. So eventually everybody, including Muhammad, make it to Mina, and the stage is set for the sacrifice. The Prophet Muhammad, as you said, does this farewell speech, which interestingly, depending upon which source you read, he says something different. But in all of them, it's like the culminating speech. It's like, this is, now that I'm going to be gone, this is the most important thing to remember. So, for example, he sets up the Islamic calendar in one of them, meaning that they no longer intercalate the months, so that they move throughout the year as they appear to now. A number of different things. Then he does something, he does several things. So I'll kind of go through it. The first thing he does is the camels are slaughtered. And we're not sure from the sources if he did it himself or somebody else did it, but we know that there was a butcher involved to actually cut up the meat. So maybe Muhammad did the actual killing of the camels, and then there was a butcher assigned for the meat. So the first thing is the camels get killed. The second thing is that he passes out all of the trappings of the animals. So their hides and their bridles and all that stuff. It all gets passed out to all of his followers there. So this is supposed to be all the followers of the time too. I don't know how many were there, but it's everybody who had one of his followers at the time. So he passes all that out. Then the animal has been cut up. They cook it there. They cook all of the meat. And so another thing that I found interesting, that maybe even is a contentious issue, is he specifically instructs Ali to make a special broth with a piece from each of the camels, and for only he and Ali to share that meal. So as you know, there's a lot of dispute over succession to the Prophet Muhammad. And so some people see this as like a signal, right? That Muhammad was saying, oh, Ali's going to be the guy after I'm gone. I'm having this special meal with him. And then as you mentioned before, as part of the Hajj rituals of desacralization, he clips his fingernails and cuts his hair. And according to the hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, every single one of the hairs got passed out to somebody. And then it's usually identified that Abu Talha and his wife Salama were responsible for passing it out to the men and the women. So I know you just asked me for the summary, but immediately probably people who study religion are like, oh, this is like Jesus, right? He has this Last Supper and he passes out pieces of his body. And oh, it's like Buddhism, right? Where the Buddha does this too. And I just always thought that's too easy an answer, right? You can't just say, oh, it's like these other ones. There's got to be something else going on there. So that's the basic story, and it raises a lot of questions for me, not all of which I was able to answer.
No, absolutely. And, I speak both as a student of religion and obviously as a believer in the religion of Islam, and in a sense that this particular event has preoccupied my mind, even though I never really delved deeply into research on it. But the idea of the completion of religion, the starting of the new age, so to say, that famous statement, which I think is underappreciated. And I think you bring it up in the first or the second page of your book, where the Prophet, peace be upon him, reportedly had said that the time had returned the same way it was when the heavens and the earth had been created. So the kind of like the restoration of time, the beginning of the new age, resetting the cosmical clock, so to say. The cosmic clock. This is like mind-blowing stuff.
It's a big deal, yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. And I always found in just my own personal practice and understanding of Islam that to be extremely powerful symbolism. And then when I read your book, it's almost as if a lot of those things came together, and that's why I said it's an absolutely mind-blowing book, and I absolutely enjoyed it. And I think it needs to be read several times because it is so dense. It is clear that you spent a lot of time researching. I think the end notes are like more than a bibliography, is like 100+ pages, I believe.
Well, the publisher didn't want to publish the whole bibliography. And so
it's an abridged bibliography.
No, I had to get a grant from the Naval Academy to pay a subvention for the bibliography, the whole bibliography to be published. Because I said, we got to have the whole bibliography.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. So, okay, so that's sort of the story. And obviously there are many more details, and you talk about it in the book, and there's only that much we can touch on here. But I want to bring us back to religious studies and the camel myth. Yeah. You mentioned it earlier about Robertson, and you bring it up through the book and bring it up in your conclusion. Yeah. But tell us about the camel myth, the St. Nihilist sacrifice, and why is it important, relevant, and how do you connect it to animal sacrifice in Islam?
Yeah, those are all really good questions, which I try to answer, and I'm not sure that I do. The last part is the easy part. And that is that Robertson Smith's work, his lectures on the religion of the Semites, which are actually in two parts, but it's the first part that people focus on, becomes the foundation for the models that are used by the modern study of religion. And you can trace that through Durkheim and Freud and Levi-Strauss. And I take it all the way up to Valerio Valeri's work on sacrifice in Hawaii. So he was a student of Levi-Strauss and Louis Dumont. So that clearly, if I'm a scholar of religion studying something I call a sacrifice, I have to be aware of the history of where my model came from. So it comes from him. And maybe, I don't think it is, it's a coincidence that it was also a camel sacrifice from 6th century Arabia. So the issue with that camel sacrifice is that most scholars think it never happened. Eliade, the famed, Romanian scholar of religion who was at Chicago for all those years, basically called it like the biggest myth to mislead religion ever. And some of my advisors from college and graduate school who read the manuscript told me they wanted me just to say, do you think it happened or not? And I don't know if it's that easy to answer, but in my I guess it's not the first chapter, it's the introduction. I try to show that there's every reason to believe that something like that did happen. that camels were regularly being sacrificed by Arabs in the pre-Islamic period. We know that from literary sources. We know from pre-Islamic literary sources. We know it from archaeological evidence, and we know it from like epigraphy and art history. So I kind of go through the story itself. I go through the history of the literature, and it's quite complicated. And I try to, at the end, to say, well, whether it happened or not, it's taken as a fact, what Durkheim and his nephew Marcel Mauss would call a social fact, which then gets incorporated into the study of religion. So I think the story itself has reached mythical status, because whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter, right? And I think it's unavoidable that if we talk about any type of sacrifice, even if it's not in Arabia and even if it's not of camels, we have to take into account where that term came from and how it's used in the modern study of religion.
Yeah, and sort of reminded, also the story of, Salih in the Quran. There is that story of the camel, of the people, obviously indicates that people used to slaughter camels, but there was this one camel they were not supposed to touch, right? And
when a camel comes out of the side of a mountain, you're pretty much like, hey, let's be careful with that one,
Yeah, so it's a story that actually is confirmed in the Quran, in a way that also that kind of memory of camel sacrifice existed in Arabia, and obviously, even though the Quran makes only a cursory reference to it in just a couple of verses, it indicates that people knew what the story was talking about. And I do remember, this is one of the things that stuck with me. I don't know if you are aware, but there's a lot of things that you and I discussed that till this day I still remember.
You probably have a better memory than I do.
And one of the things that that stuck with me in my conversation with you years ago when we were colleagues is when you always mentioned, when the Quran talks about certain things, it assumes that people know what it's referring to. And that's why you don't find like full stories in the Quran, because the background is already there. It's steeped in that, Arabian late antiquity, with all its religions and myths and stories and everything else, whether it be the people of the cave or, the story of the camel and so on. And so obviously the Quran comes at a certain point in human history. And you already indicated that the burials of camels and warriors took place in late antiquity, including in ancient Arabia. So maybe tell us a little bit more about that, because I think that background is important, and the symbolism. What is the symbolism of this?
Yeah, and let me just briefly follow up with what you asked before. I'm sure many, I'm sure and I'm sure many of the people listening know the work of someone who influenced me deeply and was a friend of mine. He passed recently, Yaroslav Stajkevich, and his work on camels and pre-Islamic poetry. And Suzanne Stajkevich's work, of course, is very well known as well, dealing with that. So I felt like I didn't need to deal with pre-Islamic poetry and camels there, because it had been so masterfully done by other people. That chapter you're talking about, it was the first chapter, and it wasn't originally the first chapter. It was like chapter 3 or something. And it took the most time for me to write, because I had to educate myself in about zooarchaeology. I had to go places and see things. I had to read pretty much everything I could find on the burial of camels. And then I found out, well, there's horses getting buried too, and donkeys and dogs. And at some point I kind of had to say, well, let's pull it. I think it was after 5 years of doing this, I had to pull it all back together. And what I discovered is there seems to be a widespread practice that we don't know if it's centered in Greece or in Mesopotamia, but was certainly also practiced in the Arabian Peninsula, that when a warrior or a king who's a type of warrior was buried, alongside that person would be buried their mount. We assume it's their mount. I mean, a horse of some sort, maybe a donkey. The donkeys were apparently reserved for kings because it's a royal symbol. The dog would be maybe like bearing the sword alongside the warrior because it's part of the warrior's weapons cache. But I had Joey Corbett, who's written a dissertation on camels in pre-Islamic Arabia, had shown me a whole bunch of sources dealing with these burials in Jordan and in Arabia, and I just was fascinated by these sites. And now you may know that in the Emirates they actually have a camel burial center at Malayha, which is one of the big sites that I talk about in the book, where you can go and see a reconstruction of the camels and the horses being buried. But when I started doing this, it was all news to me. I didn't know that this was a practice. So I spent a lot of time just combing through every source I could find. And it for me, it turned out that the horse was a kind of a technological advantage. And so the warriors were bearing that, or the people were bearing their warriors with the horse to kind of symbolize, this is what allowed us to conquer these people. And the camel, similarly in Arabia, it was something that the Arabs specifically used. And just as an aside, a lot of people think that the Arabs were successful because they fought with camels. You don't fight on camels because they're not as fast as horses, but you take your camels way across the desert where you got horses waiting for you that you use to attack the enemy. And even back to like 4,000 years ago, you look at the Assyrian records, the Arabs are always associated with the camels that they've got, the warriors. So I thought that was a significant and pertinent way of understanding what was happening when Muhammad sacrifices camels. What did these mean to people? It wasn't just, he raided them from somebody, or it meant how rich he was. But this is part of a long, even millennia-long tradition that kings and warriors, which he arguably was cast as both by the sources, that they were buried with these things. And it's interesting that he does the sacrifice himself before his death, which has significance as well that I talk about later in the book.
Yeah, that's really, like you said, once you start opening that chapter, it just leads you on a journey of learning and getting to know things. And what I really appreciate also is you explaining to us the process of your research. It's not something that you just were handed out, or it's knowledge that's commonly known. It's just that you had these questions and you wanted to answer them. It took you years to visit different sites, to collect the data, to collect evidence, to read books, to talk to scholars, And
that last part's the most important part, talking to other people who study this stuff and learning from them what they know.
Yeah, no, that's really important. I think for the researchers that are watching this, it's a great kind of close view of the process that goes into creating. People see a book like this and they don't often realize that some of these books took decade or two to
long time
to go from idea to fruition, to do all that research. So this brings us, I think, to the pre-Islamic rituals in Arabia as well. Again, the Quran makes certain references. Like, for instance, the verse in the Quran that says that Safa and Marwa are indeed from the signs of God, or rituals.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is no harm in, in going between the two of them while performing the Hajj or Umrah. And apparently this was revealed as a response to the question when people asked the Prophet, should we still do this? Which obviously shows that people used to do this before the coming of the Prophet.
Yes.
And so, so tell us a little bit about these pre-Islamic rituals, especially the Hajj rituals, and how did the Quran and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, intervene in these practices? What changes did they make, if any?
So a lot of this is contained in the third chapter, which I still am most unsure about, and it was probably the hardest to write. I got a lot of help from presenting that at conferences where experts in epigraphy and rock art and other things would say, no, you're going down the wrong road there. You got to look at this. And We don't know when we look at a piece of rock art and it's got camels on it and people hunting them, when this is from. Is it from like the 4th century of the Common Era, or is it from 3,000 years earlier? Are those wild camels, or are they domesticated camels? So one of the big problems, though, that's a small problem, is that when we want to try to know what went on in pre-Islamic Arabia, specifically around Mecca in the Hejaz, we almost entirely have to rely on the Arabic sources, the Arabic Islamic sources, which are hundreds of years later, maybe sometimes even longer than that away. And so many people have questioned whether those sources are actually telling us the true story, and not because they're trying to lie, but maybe they just didn't know. And maybe they're using evidence that's been transmitted over long periods of time, or like Herodotus did when he didn't know something, he just made something up that sounded good. So I had a lot of trouble in that chapter talking about the pre-Islamic Hajj and trying to think about it in terms of, okay, now I'm being told this by Arab Muslim scholars that this happened in the pre-Islamic period, the same way when you read, like in the Bible, they'll talk about the Hittites or the Amorites, and they were really bad people, right? So clearly what came before Islam wasn't good, right? So we're going to be replacing that. You mentioned Safa and Marwa, for example. So we have a lot of traditions that those were idols and that people used to go and smear blood on them, which may have been the reason why people were worried about running back and forth between them. Like, oh, Muhammad, like, these are idols, right? Are we going to do this? And he said, yeah, don't worry about it. We're going to do that now. So eventually what I came up with was that I'm not talking about what actually happened in the pre-Islamic period. I'm talking about what the Arabic Islamic sources tell us they think happened, and then trying to log, what's the right word? Trying to correlate that with what we know from material evidence. So from archaeology or from rock art or epigraphy. And we have nothing in literary sources about Mecca before Islam. There just doesn't, I mean, there's some debate over whether it's mentioned here or there, but basically, in my view, we don't have anything. So we're stuck with a situation where we've got a lot of information, but it's all coming from Arabic Islamic sources. And then we have a growing body of material evidence as people go out there and collect it. And to try to bring those two things together is challenging. But what to answer your question in short, what I think happened was that the pre-Islamic Hajj and Umrah rituals, which were actually separate in the pre-Islamic period, the Umrah focused on the Kaaba and Mecca, the Hajj was part of the Dhu al-Majaz fair, which took place in the valley outside of Mecca. I mean, you've been there, it's like 10 miles away. It's pretty far. And they were brought together and they were united in the Islamic Hajj. And then I'm sure you'll ask later, and it's going to be hard answering that, harder than this, but then all of that was linked with Abraham, right? So it wasn't that we're reuniting pre-Islamic pagan rituals. It's like, oh yeah, this was all something Abraham did, but then it got corrupted over time and it fell into misunderstanding. And so we're just like bringing that back together.
That's exactly my next question.
Yeah, well, I preempted it.
No, yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about Ibrahim, peace be upon him. He obviously looms large in the story of Hajj. For the Muslims, as you said, the Hajj story reconnects or connects that story to Ibrahim. And so what is his relevance for the Hajj sacrifice, and how does Islam view him compared to Judaism, Christianity? What role does he play? Is it different, or how does Islam reconstitute the role of Abraham or Ibrahim compared to Judaism and Christianity in that new heralding, that new age and new beginning and so on?
Well, I really like John Levinson's book on inheriting Abraham, where he makes the argument that a lot of people talk about Abrahamic religions, meaning Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, yet Abraham, if you picked any figure, is the one about which they all disagree. right? They all say he's the founder of our religion. No, he's the founder of our religion. So I think the short answer to your question is that classical Muslim scholars use the figure of Abraham to what I would call biblicize the rituals of the Hajj. They turned this pre-Islamic Arabian ritual into something that was part of the fabric of the call it the Judeo-Christian biblical story, that this is a major patriarch. He's the guy who kind of founded, I mean, for Christians, right? He's the first Christian way before Jesus. And for Judaism, he's the founding father of the Jews. So it's obvious that that's the guy you're going to pick, right? And plus, there's all this stuff in the Bible that Jews and Christians have interpreted to be taking place up near Palestine or something. But if you look at it, it's like, no, this looks like Arabia. This looks like he's in Mecca or something. So the Muslim exegetes in particular, like, oh yeah, the Bible's full of references to Abraham being down in Arabia. The one thing that I still cannot figure out quite is that if the sacrifice that comes at the end of the Hajj is supposed to have been instituted by Abraham, right? And Muhammad is just kind of re-showing people this is what we do. Then why did Muhammad sacrifice 100 camels? Because it's clear that Abraham did not. Abraham sacrificed a wild ram. So, and it's the ram that Abel slew at the beginning of time, Habel, right? That he slew the animal and then his brother killed him. God took the animal up into heaven and brings it back so Abraham can sacrifice it. Now the location is the same. It's the mountain near Mina. But Muhammad doesn't sacrifice a ram. He does 100 camels. And so that, for me, that meant there was still a huge question there. And I think part of the answer is that the people writing the stories about what happened and linking the origins of Islam with Abraham and this larger, and I don't mean it in any sort of a political way, but this larger biblical world, they lived up in the north. They lived in urban centers, far away from Arabia. And they may have gone to Arabia for Hajj or Umrah one time, but they didn't know what it was like when Muhammad lived there. And we're even told that Mecca was not a place where people lived. There's a lot of traditions. Even Muhammad himself says, don't settle there. It's kind of like a place, like a fairgrounds, where you go. There's some people who kind of live there to maintain it, but then everybody shows up once a year when the big event takes place. So it's hard to try to disentangle what the sources tell us from when they told us and where they were when they told us something was happening that could have been hundreds of years earlier in a place 1,000 miles away.
Yeah, that is, and what I like about your presentation, your book, is that you are very forthcoming about the fact that you still have a lot of questions, a lot of unanswered questions, that is humbling on some level, and it also shows that you're very serious at your craft, which is you don't claim to have all the answers. When you hear somebody claims to have all the answers, then run away, right?
or ask them if they could please tell us what they are. So
yeah, exactly. I don't think they do, but again, connecting all those different symbolisms and to the Quran, the Quran also very consciously refers to that. There is that famous verse in the Quran that Abraham was neither Christian or a Jew, but he was someone who submits to God, Muslim and Hanifa.
Yeah, however we translate that term Hanif, right?
Yeah, I'm not translating. I remember you and once I asked you actually about it, and you said to me, like, I've been looking into it. I don't think anybody quite fully understands what it really means,
I don't think the people who heard it the first time knew what it meant.
Yeah.
I think they're like, this is an interesting term, and I think it was always been like a technical term, and people just left it that way.
Yeah, but it's also the kind of term that even if you can't translate or know the exact meaning, you kind of intuitively kind of get what it means, and it's an interesting consideration in relation to to this particular topic and the question that I asked.
Yes.
I usually take most of the time I take questions at the end, but we have a question from Professor Muhammad Fadl. I'm going to take it because it's about something we just discussed.
Yeah.
And probably go back to it now. Muhammad says, hi, Brannon, not quite sure I understood the connection between camel sacrifice and warrior culture. Could you clarify that?
Sure. So if you look at the place where the most evidence is, it's from Greece. The Greeks, both in the archaic phase and in the classical phase, but mostly in the archaic phase and also under the Mycenaeans in Cyprus, buried war chariots, and they buried horses, and they also buried warriors with swords and armor and various other things. And part of the way that all of that is interpreted, the same thing happens in ancient Iraq, and also in southern Palestine, where the Egyptians had influence. The way it's interpreted is that the weapons and the swords and the horses and the chariots are symbols of the warrior class, that they represent the technology that allowed them to conquer the local people. So the Indo-European peoples were largely the ones who used horses, both in India. And India has this huge horse ritual that takes place each year as well. The Romans had one called the Equus October. So when I found the camel material in Arabia, and I found that in some of the places they were also bearing horses as well, the only thing that really changed was the animal, right? They were still bearing warriors with swords and with armor, sometimes with chariots, and sometimes also with horses and with dogs. So it makes sense to me, given what we know about the conquests and the movements of people, that the warrior class would be celebrated for its technological innovations. So in Arabia, the camel was kind of the epitome. I mean, we maybe if we lived 200 years ago, we'd say it's like the Arabian totem animal, right? It's the animal. When you think camel, like the first thing you think is Arabia, and almost vice versa, right? You think of Arabia and you think of a camel. So it's an animal that's been associated with that culture. So the use of it in burials alongside warriors was a way of kind of representing, well, I think, we don't know, a way of representing that warrior status with the society, that they're the ones who conquered the land, that allowed it to be settled, that kept it safe. And that's why they brought the two together. So thank you, Mohammed. I haven't talked to you in a long time, but that's a really good question.
Thank you. Thanks. I hope it answers it. Now, we started with the story of Hajj, and we went on this journey to try to understand it better. Now let's go back to it. One of the remarkable features, and we already said that at the beginning of the farewell pilgrimage of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the distribution of the body of the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah.
So tell us more about this fascinating set of events, this act, I remember when you published this, I think, as a self-standing paper a while ago, and it was part of this long research that you were doing for the book. And I remember when I first read it, even though I knew from some of the Muslim sources, from the hadith, the general story, but you kind of collected a lot of it under that umbrella. So tell us more about this.
So it's a question I've been dealing with for a long time, and it's the place where this book most clearly grows out of the work that I had done before in my Mecca and Eden book, because I made the argument there that the distribution of material relics, of bodily relics, and of what I call the textual relics, the hadith, represented a type of civilizational model. And I won't recount that because that's a different book, but I tried to make that argument there. So I don't know that I changed my argument. I think this is chapter 5, and it bleeds into chapter 6 a little bit when I wrote it this time. But I will note a couple of things that I focused more on that I learned. One is the significance of death. And there's a great piece, and I don't want to mention the author's name because I'm probably going to get it wrong, but I can remember later, about the dead body of the Prophet Muhammad. It's in French. And he specifically makes the argument that it's the fact that the body is dead that's important, because so many people who study, for example, Christian relics or Buddhist relics, they're like, oh yeah, well, the body parts are actually alive. And the fact that there's the person's finger is here means that somehow I'm in touch with that person's living presence or something like that. And he makes the argument, no, it's emphasizing that the prophet is gone now. And now that he's gone, we have to do things differently because we don't have him anymore to answer our questions and tell us this is the way we're supposed to do things. In other words, we have to set up civilization now, right? Because we don't have someone around us who can just say, yeah, I'm going to tell you the right thing to do here, or whatever the case is. So that got me thinking a lot about rituals that involve hair and the distribution of hair. And it turns out that across the Middle East, but also other parts of the world, but I focused on that, hair is almost always involved in funeral rituals. The distribution of hair, as you know, it's also part of the Aqiqah ceremony. So it's part of the birth ritual as well. Probably the most interesting thing I discovered in working on that chapter was the fact that Mecca was considered a graveyard, that there are hundreds of prophets that are supposed to be buried around the Kaaba in Mecca. And I had never heard this before. I had heard that Ishmael was buried there and maybe Hajar was buried there. And I started reading stuff in Ibn Hajar and in other sources, all of which are in the book. And I'm like, wow, this is really interesting, because the other sanctuaries that we know about in late antiquity, like Petra in Jordan, or Madain Saleh, or even Jerusalem, all of these sites were places where people went on pilgrimage to visit the tombs of prophets. It's one of the reasons you go there. Even still today, you go to Jerusalem to visit the tombs of the prophets there. And so it made me start to think about the symbolism of the Prophet Muhammad's body physically, his hair and nails, so he didn't pass out pieces of his flesh like Jesus supposed to have done, or the Buddha did. And then also the symbolism of the camels. I think I argue more in the conclusion that the camels clearly symbolize Muhammad's body. The references to the fact that if you kill a person, you have to give 100 camels. Or if you want to marry a woman, you have to pay the father 100 camels. So 100 camels was always the number that was the worth of a person. So one of the things I liked about the Prophet Muhammad's camel sacrifice is that there was no doubt left what was going on. He passed out the pieces of the camel, which were symbolic representations of his own body. And in case you didn't get that, then he passed out actual pieces of his body. So he's like, yeah, that's what I'm doing here, because I'm going to be gone soon. And when I'm gone, that's when things are going to start going, and you're going to have to figure out what to do.
Yeah, that's the part that leaves me speechless. Almost, it's absolutely amazing, and it's sort of poking you in the eye in all of the sources and everything we have.
Yeah.
But that kind of connection is so important to make. We do have one more question, but I have one last question. I would like us to conclude, and then we'll turn to other questions from our audience. And what I want to do is read from the last 2 pages of your book. On page 350 and 351, I'm going to read this long paragraph, and I'm going to let you sort of unpack it or explain it to us, and then offer your conclusions that you have reached while writing this book.
Okay.
So here it is. Had Robertson Smith written about the Prophet Muhammad's camel sacrifice, he would no doubt have noted all the similarities with the camel sacrifice described by Saint Nilus. He would also have admired it as the ideal example of the kind of sacrifice he sought, sacrifice as social communion. None of the animal is wasted on the superstitious beliefs of needing to feed the gods or to curry favor with the gods by offering them a gift. Nor does the Prophet Muhammad's camel sacrifice throw out the baby with the bathwater. Islam retained sacrifice, but did so by returning to its original practical roots, to create social bonds by distributing to others what was obtained at great cost, giving something or all of yourself up for the greater goods of society. Camels offered were a symbol identifying both the Prophet Muhammad himself and the society he represented, and their sacrifice substantiated the original legitimacy of the Muslim community. From the perspective of Robertson Smith and perhaps the discipline that was built upon his views, the Islamic sacrifice is a rational, even scientific version of the Christian Eucharist. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad's camel sacrifice is the perfect Protestant version of the Last Supper. The association of the Prophet's body with the camels is clearly symbolic, reinforced by the distribution of his hair and nails, and the real function of the sacrifice, as it is understood and prescribed in Muslim jurisprudence, makes explicit what is obfuscated in other sacrifices.
Yeah, you would have to read that paragraph, right? I think when you write a book, you at the end, you feel like you have to say directly something that goes beyond, it's the feeling you got from writing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm referring to two things there, but most of it is talking about Robertson Smith and his attempt to Protestantize religion. And it seemed ironic to me, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that he saw the camel sacrifice that he observed in St. Nilas's case as a raw primeval version of what later becomes the Catholic Eucharist. Had he had access to the Prophet Muhammad's sacrifice, he would have used that instead, because he would have said, look, this is what we're talking about. This is the purpose of sacrifice. The purpose of religion is to create social cohesion. And that's what this does. It literally does that by feeding people, by saying, hey, there's people who need food, and so let's give them food. I mean, that's the basic source of society, right? Even Ibn Khaldun says God created us with the need for food so that we would form societies, because we needed to do that to feed each other. So it's just the perfect bringing together of all of the symbolism. I did not go so far. Some people wanted me, some of the readers of this, to say, and I hinted at it earlier, that Robertson Smith actually borrowed from the Islamic materials. I can't find any evidence that he knew, that was in print at that time, any of the sources that would allowed him to have known about the Prophet Muhammad's camel sacrifice. But the two were linked. He was a professor of Hebrew and Bible before he was accused of heresy. During the period of his trial, he traveled to Arabia. He went to Mecca. He went to other places. When he came back, they cleared him of heresy, but they fired him from his job anyways. And he went on to be a professor of Arabic at Cambridge, where his papers are still there today. So I was very happy when Cambridge wanted to publish this, because I said that's where Robertson Smith was. So I don't know that I unpacked that paragraph very well, but I think the only way to truly unpack it is to refer back to everything else I said in the book.
No, I think you did, actually. And, I reread that paragraph at least 4 or 5 times, because, it sort of sums up, and of course, the rest of that last page of the book, or what you really wanted to say at the end, but it's just so powerful in my opinion. Let's go now we have a couple of questions. Professor Richard McGregor, he says, perhaps an obscure question. Have you found any detail on the qala'id, decorative hats, that Aisha made from Muhammad's sacrificial animals, or references to other coverings for sacrificial animals?
Yes, definitely. It's in chapter 3, I believe. And I talk a lot about the traditions that we get from Islamic Arabic sources, that the wool that she used to make the qala'id was taken from certain animals, and that also the leaves that were used were taken from the trees that were sacred to the goddess Al-Uzza. So there's some debate going on in the sources of whether or not this was maybe a pre-Islamic pagan practice of weaving these qala'id. And there's also evidence in some of the hadith that the pilgrims themselves would wear the qala'id. So you'd not just, I mean, we know from Greek sources that you would mark an animal with a necklace that was going to be sacrificed. So that's pretty common. But then that the sacrificer, the person going to sacrifice the animal, would also wear that in the pre-Islamic period to identify them with the animal that was going to represent them. But yeah, there's actually quite a bit of information about those, and it's comes from the Hadith.
Yeah, and I think it's on page 161 of the book, just for the reference.
The beauty of being able to search a PDF, right?
Well, no, it's actually in your index. I just referred to the index, and
took a very long time to
index. Yeah. All right. So we go back to Professor Muhammad Fadl. He says, I agree with much of what you say in your conclusion, except for the meat representing the body of the Prophet. If that is the case, how can we explain the continuity of the practice after the Prophet?
So I'm trying to figure out exactly the question. The meat meaning the meat of the camels.
I guess that's what it is. Yeah, the meat of the camel representing the body of the Prophet, I believe.
Yeah, and
so he says he doesn't, he agrees with much of what you say here, but except for that part.
Yeah, I'm not sure I say that. I'm not sure I say that the meat, the camels themselves are substitutes for Muhammad's body. So it's a representation as a substitute, the same way that Abraham substituted the ram for his son. So he didn't kill a human, he killed the animal instead. And I think that's what it's, I mean, there's dozens of books in the field of religion that talk about substitution as the primary thing that sacrifice does. I'm not sure that's true, but it's a part of it. So I think I would be curious to talk to Professor Fadl and see where he thought I said that. And if I did, I should be more clear. But I think the camel's substitute for Muhammad's killing his, distributing his own body. But the meat is clearly feeding people an animal, not a human. I mean, in the Buddhist traditions, anytime the Buddha teaches somebody something, it's said that he's feeding them his body. And I don't think that's what's going on in the Islamic tradition. And clearly in the origins of the Eucharist in Christianity, the bread is associated with the flesh of Jesus. So I don't think that kind of transubstantiation is going on here. I think the camels are a substitute for Muhammad's body. And then the dead pieces of his body, so to speak, right? The pieces he doesn't need, the hair and the nails, which are removed. And remember, when you're on the Hajj, you're actually dressed in the shroud that you probably will be buried in. Many people are buried in the funeral, the pilgrim garb, so that he's actually just distributing those pieces as a kind of a symbolism. And I think that's what I said in that paragraph on page 350, that it is symbolic. It's not meant to be taken literally.
I believe so too, but yeah, Professor Fadl said, he said, maybe I misunderstood what you said. We'll have to read the book. But yeah, that's, I think that's a sort of good answer. I have a question of my own, but I want to give time to because I already asked many. I want to give time and space to our audience. So we have Muhammad Ayub Khan. He said, in travelogues of South Asian Hajj pilgrims, they mention carrying soil and clay from Mecca and Medina back to their homes as a source of barakah. Is this something unique to Islam?
No, not at all. You go to Egypt, you go to Upper Egypt, like the temples in Luxor and Aswan, and you look at the pillars and you'll see that there's scrapes on all of the pillars, because people would literally just, let me scrape off a piece of that pillar so I can bring it home. I remember going to the, blanking on the name of it, the museum in Oxford, in the UK. It'll come to me in a minute. And they had a whole case of what they called, they labeled it magical amulets or something. And there were several leather bags that contained dust from the inside of the Kaaba. And I know today it's still a big deal who gets to go into the Kaaba each year and sweep it out and clean it. But dating back, maybe hundreds of years, the pilgrims would be distributed the dust from the inside of the Kaaba as cleaning it. And as probably a lot of us know, Shi'is also have soil from Karbala that they use when they're prostrating themselves in prayer and prayer beads and things. It would be expected. I'm glad that we got the question because it's super important. I talked about that in my last book. I called it portable territory, that you could have the significance of the place home with you. You could you go to the Vatican, right? You can get holy water. You go to Palestine, Christians go and they get holy water from the Jordan River, so you actually bring the place back with you as a way of connecting with it.
Yeah, definitely. That's something that I think exists across various religious traditions. I'm also reminded of, for instance, the kiswa of the Kaaba, the shroud or the cover of the Kaaba, which is replaced every year. And then when it's replaced, it's cut into pieces and it's sent to different parts of the Muslim world. Different countries claim it to different people. And sometimes they would even have it on their wall, or they would have it in a museum. They would say, this is a piece of the kiswa of the Kaaba. So I think it goes across different objects and different religious traditions.
And there's a fantastic Kiswa museum near Mecca.
Yes.
And it reconstructs what the Kaaba used to look like. A lot of it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's where they make Kiswa every year,
probably,
right?
Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
There's the great book by the person who asked the question just recently about the making of the Kiswas in Egypt and taking them down on the Hajj.
Yeah, very good. So I do have a follow-up question. Now, the Saudi Arabian government seems to be liberalizing its visa and visit policy to Saudi Arabia, and that opens the door not only for to tourists but also to researchers. For a long time, people have considered Arabia to be kind of just like desert, and there is nothing there. We do know that there is a lot of artifacts in Arabia. So how do you see this, what is happening? This is not necessarily related to the book, but to a wider kind of, how do you see this facilitating research, for those who would like to learn more about history? You see yourself going to Arabia, maybe having now greater access than in the past, and things like that.
Well, I need to go back again. I've been a couple times, and the last time we were there, we spent a lot of time on the West Coast, went all the way down to Abha and then all the way up north. And there's so much to see there, and it's so huge. I mean, you're driving for days trying to go somewhere. In order to get to the rock art in Juba, we had to drive all day through a sandstorm, and finally, then it's another 70 kilometers into the desert. I don't know that it's going to change much, because there is a lot of archaeology going on in the kingdom now. There are foreign expeditions, as we would call them, and there's a lot that are paired with Saudis. There's an excellent archaeology department at the university. I'm going to get the king's name wrong, but the one in Riyadh. The archaeology department is excellent.
Aziz, I believe.
Yeah, and Suleiman Adib is a top scholar. He's written on epigraphy, and he's written lots and lots of books. And he's been very helpful for me as well when I went there. But I agree, there's tons of stuff that needs to be seen there, not just in the Islamic period, but in the pre-Islamic period. And the other place that we need to actually be able to spend more time in is Yemen. Because there's a lot of stuff in Yemen.
Oh, there is.
Just it's horrific what's going on there now, and it's just if we can go there sometime, that would be great. I only spent a week in Yemen a while back, and that was not enough time to do anything but ride around in a taxi with cot chewing drivers.
Yeah, well, if you do, let me know. I'd like to hang out with you.
Yeah, it'd be great.
It would be great. That was so we do have one more question from Alia Khan. She says, thank you. Even in the context of injunctions to give blessings of the Prophet and family, how does distribution of his hair and nails work with prohibitions on venerating his graven image? Why are hair and nails as material parts of him different, given that the expectation should reasonably be that they would be venerated similarly to saints' relics?
Yeah. Well, so a direct answer, which would need a lot more unpacking, is that the hair is symbolic. And that it's not connected with the Prophet anymore, and you're not you're not venerating the prophet. You're venerating what he did, what he created. And his hair, in fact, is supposed to be symbolic of the spread of his message. So his hair goes out with his followers, and each of those followers spreads to a new location far away from Mecca. And then they have more followers, right? The Sahaba, then the Tabi'in, and the Tabi'in. And with each generation, the message gets spread farther and farther from Mecca. So I think the prohibition on saint veneration is that you're focusing on an individual being able to intercede on your behalf, whereas the emphasis on venerating the hairs or the nails or the swords, whatever it is, it's thinking about the spread of Islam and the spread of the ideas that were revealed to Muhammad and then his practices to a much larger community.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. And again, the word veneration, what does that mean by veneration? Does it mean attaching symbolic, kind of appearance to it, or is it kind of for worship type of purposes, intercession and so on? And that, I think, makes that differentiation, which you have explained really well. I don't think we have any more questions, and we've been at it for a little bit over an hour, which is usually the time that we take. So I want to give the last word to you, Brannon. If there is anything else that maybe you wanted to say but you didn't get to, or anything else about the book, maybe tell us when the paperback is going to be published, because I think right now the cost is prohibitive for a lot of people.
Well, I understand, and I have no idea when the paperback is going to come out. The publisher makes all those decisions, and once you publish something with them, they kind of disappear.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would say that I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I still have lots of questions, and I tried to make it clear in my writing that I was exploring these ideas, and I hope that other people will read what I've written and say, hey, here's what I think, right? Because that's the whole process, is learning by putting out your ideas and having other people respond to you.
Obviously. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Also glad to reconnect in this way, and hopefully in person soon.
Hope so, yeah. This whole thing has this kind of spooky COVID air to it,
Yeah, it does. Well, thank you once again, Brannon, for this. Thank you to everyone who spent the last hour with us, or the part thereof. This is also going to be available on YouTube for later viewing. And also, please visit our website at contemporaryislam.org to get more information about the upcoming talks. We have 3 more book discussions this semester, and the next one is on September 26th, when I'm discussing with Wala Kuwaisi her book on neo-traditionalism in contemporary Islam. Well, thanks again, and till next viewing, all the best.
Thank you, Armin.
You're most welcome.